These are the main ideas behind assumptions and premises. Assumptions are not bad. You have to have assumptions. Assumptions guide your research. They guide the evidence you bring into your research. You are assuming something is factual and true in order to initiate the reasoning process to lead to a certain conclusion and to make an argument for yourself. And so if we did not have assumptions, then every single point would have to rely on another point of evidence, and then on another point of evidence, and then that on another point of evidence. It would be never ending. It would be a perpetual cycle of trying to prove that something is factual into perpetuity. And instead of doing that, we have to understand our audience, our purpose, our context in order to make assumptions that we think our audience would somewhat agree with or share based on who our audience is. That's what we do as a writer. And then we make those assumptions in order to provide a premise and or thesis for our argument that we are going to be provided. They're not bad. We have to have them. The idea is that you have to be able to recognize when assumptions are being made and how to evaluate them and practice caution with them. So, for instance, with the previous example of we all want that summer tan, we would need to exercise caution and know that when we come across that in any kind of type of academic setting to say, well, this is absolutely outlandish, that can't be true, that can't be something that everyone assumes is fact. But to understand that, you have to think critically. You have to understand your audience, the context, the purpose, the topic, the idea. And this is all why the micro and macro level of analysis and the critical analytical framework is so important, because you have to filter your ideas through that. You have to understand every aspect of your rhetorical situation, if you will, or your academic situation or topic in order to make an argument about it. And then you have to analyze your audience to make sure that, before you make any type of argument that, certain assumptions are shared, certain ideas are relevant, etc. Assumptions typically deal with values that cannot be proven. They're not factual. So when we make those analytical types of assumptions where there's some type of direction, it's not just factual. It's something that opinion is typically divided. It typically has to do with higher level issues of values, core values of society, worldview. And so this goes back to all of the things that we typically don't write about in academic writing. Again, we are objective. We're completely neutral in academic writing. And that's the issue with assumptions, is that they directly relate back to who your audience is, what they believe, what their attitudes are, what their beliefs are. And as academics, we have to leverage that. We have to realize that we have to take ourselves out of our writing and still make assumptions that kind of leverage our different audience members, something that they would probably realistically share in some way in order to make an argument that would be believed or believable, if you will. The idea is to know assumptions, know what an assumption is. When you come across it, to be able to highlight it, to be able to extract it from your reading and know that that is an assumption, to be able to test their validity and determine whether or not it's a factual or analytical assumption and whether or not it's valid in the context of the argument. And then also understanding your audience, breaking down your audience to determine whether or not an assumption is appropriate for that particular audience. When we talk about an argument in itself, the heart of an argument, the thesis, the premise, the assumptions, all of the main the main heart of an argument is often stated in the introduction, but it can also be stated in the conclusion, depending on the organization of the piece, the outline, if you will, the organizational schematic. Sometimes the argument is implicit or implied. The author wants the audience to connect the dots. More times than none, that happens in more higher level, graduate level types of writing where the writer is introducing the idea and chronologically or spatially or topically in order of importance, organizing the ideas, building up to the argument, that at the end of the argument, it would be undeniable that, the premise or assumption would be true. That doesn't really happen a lot in undergrad, for instance, bachelor's degrees type of academic writing. Most of the time it's explicit, as I mentioned before, usually in the introduction. Here is an example. When most people think of normal activities for a 6-year-old girl, they picture a sea full of Barbie dolls, coloring books, and dress-up clothes. Popular shows such as Toddlers and Tiaras, which revolves around exaggerated filming of child pageantry, shows America one narrow view of what the pageant world is all about. The media distorts how society views pageants, but they can be beneficial because they give children contestants useful life lessons, and they can be viewed on the same positive level as other competitive sports. That is a quote, so you see the quote marks before and after. And then there's a in-text citation there. Again, it would typically be author last name, comma, page number of that source. That's the format that an in-text citation would take. So here we clearly see a bias. We clearly see emotionally loaded language. We can also clearly see assumptions. We can see where the author of this piece is developing what they assume to be truth, right? Popular shows such as Toddlers and Tiaras present a narrow view. It's not actual factual content. It's showing a very myopic or narrow view of something that tends to be much greater or much more beneficial, right? And so you start identifying as an academic how to extract those assumptions, because that is the starting point. Those are the contextual details that lead up to the thesis statement. So for instance, in this particular excerpt, the very last sentence could be seen as the thesis statement, right? That's the heart of the argument. What you're discussing, why you're discussing it, and how. The media distorts how society views pageants, but they can be beneficial because they give children contestants useful life lessons that can be viewed on the same positive level as other competitive sports. That's exactly, what's going to be discussed. That covers the main points of the essay, the perspective by which it's being viewed, but the details and the assumptions and the premises in that introductory section leading up to that thesis really frame that thesis. It gives it drive. It gives it a direction. That's the analytical assumption part, right? So, for instance, popular shows, the one example I just read, popular shows such as Toddlers and Tiaras, which revolves around exaggerated filming of child pageantry, shows America one narrow view of what the pageant world is all about. That's more of an analytical type of assumption. It's taking something that's not just factual. It's not just a show in itself. It's not something that data would prove, but it's giving it a different direction. It's giving it a different spin or perception, right? And then it leads up to a thesis statement. And so oftentimes what you find is that an effective argument presents those contextual details in the introduction. It gives the reader everything they need to know about what it is you want to present about your argument. What are the baseline essential details that the audience needs to know? And then you find your analytical assumptions, where an assumption is being made in some kind of way in which the author assumes that the audience is sharing the same perspective in some kind of way. And then that leads to your thesis statement. And so in academic works, you often see this type of format of contextual details, assumptions, thesis statement. That's usually your introductory section, and it leads up to where you start integrating sources, evidence, and data to support those claims and assumptions. If we had a longer class, we would normally look at how to compare and contrast different arguments. So arguments from different authors. I'm just going to breeze through this because we're not really focusing on that too much in this class. But if you were looking at arguments from different people, different viewpoints, if you will, you compare those arguments made by different authors based on the same topic or issue. So there has to be a common idea that's debatable, but the claims are different, if you will. So they are arguing something different. They take a different stance, a different viewpoint. And we ask ourselves, what is each author arguing? Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? We also have to look at the evidence. Does one author include more authoritative or credible sources than the other author? Does one rely too much on anecdotal or narrative evidence or stories, not really data, but just emotional type stories? It may be interesting, but not typical. Is one author missing a crucial illustration a reader might need to grasp a point? So in other words, is one author providing all of the essential details that are necessary, all of the pieces of logic and reasoning that the reader would need to follow to be able to grasp the idea. In other words, to follow through the reasoning process from the if this, then that. If that's missing, then that's something that we would use to assess between two different arguments. And then context. I'm going to go ahead and populate these here. Again, context, all of the internal and external factors that affects the transmission of a message. So when we look at context, or situation, if you will, this can be social, political perspectives that affects the difference of opinion, such as political status for political speeches or socioeconomic status, cultural differences in the examples such as the tan, the assumption that we all want that summer tan. A contextual factor would be that, based on different cultures, we have different world views, different social strata statuses that would determine that a tan is, no more desirable than would be considered luxury, right? And also context would be recognizing that someone has a stake that's different than their own, or appreciating that all aspects of the opposing opinion are being brought to the table and addressed in some kind of way. We'll talk more about conclusion later. And also has to do with the arguer recognizing their own biases or preconceptions. It is common practice in academic writing that if someone is closely associated with a topic in some kind of way, that they introduce it, that they put it in their writing in some kind of way. I'm a researcher or I've been researching so-and-so for so-and-so many years, or in the introductory materials to the research paper, they will address that they have a degree in this or that. And so it's addressed in some kind of way to show the audience that they are being transparent and clear with their bias towards the topic. Effective arguments do several things. They support a main claim or thesis. Think of a claim as your thesis. With a set of supporting claims or main ideas or sub-ideas, if you will. Claims are typically the topic sentences for body paragraphs. Remember, in the classical outline of an essay, you have an introduction, main point A, B, C, and a conclusion. Main points A, B, and C would be your supporting claims. They're your supporting main ideas that are reinforcing your thesis statement, which is the claim for your argument. Each stage of the argument, the claim and supporting ideas, is illustrated with logical and reliable evidence. So what this is saying is, as you present each idea, main point A, when you start providing evidence and support, you are pulling in sources that are credible, that are data-driven, that are factual. This is the place where factual evidence is important. And then you're using that objective, neutral, non-emotional, non-attached, factual information or data-driven information to make the claims for you. The idea behind an academic is not to confirm what you think to be true, but to determine what is actually true. And so that's why you suspend your worldview, your experience, your belief, because you're an investigator here as an academic. You are researching, you are determining what is actually true despite what you think, despite what others think. You're taking yourself out of it. And so all of your support for the claims that you make are going to be logical, reasoned, data-driven evidence that you pull for yourself. You look at what's going on in the academic conversation, hence the critical analytical framework. When you conduct background research in the micro level, when you're looking at what's going on, when you do a pulse check, what's the conversation with this topic, what's being said, what are all the elements of that? That's where you take that idea and start pulling sources in that support those ideas that you identify through that analysis. And then also, effective arguments show a clear understanding of opposing viewpoints and does its best to acknowledge competing claims. So in other words, aside from presenting your claim, your assumptions, your main points, your main ideas, your evidence, You're also going to be preemptive and understand what would the opposing viewpoint have to say about my